All right, so this is a workshop on Palestine, strategies of resistance, with Jewish Voice for Peace, and also we have a speaker from Adalah, and also City College. So 4 of us. The structure of the workshop is going to be that each of us, the 4 of us, is going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes, say, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. Recently, Israel has cracked down on cultural workers. Well, there's always been censorship, but it's got to a really things getting worse and worse. In the last, recently it's imprisoned Mohammed Faisal Abu Saka, a young clown who teaches circus skills to children with disabilities with no charges against him, or maybe for the crime of making Palestinian children laugh. It has imprisoned astrophysicist Imad Barghouti for material he posted on his Facebook page. It has barred BDS co-founder Omar Barghouti from traveling. It's threatening to revoke his citizenship. And Amnesty International has warned that his life is in danger. Well, anyone who is in a position of leadership and as a Palestinian is in danger, and he is clearly being targeted right now. If Israel has aimed to silence these people, they're not succeeding. Tatur says that her imprisonment, Darin Tatur, the Palestinian poet, was tried for posting for reading a poem on YouTube and for posting on Facebook. So poetry is now an illegal activity. The charges, the poem was translated by a policeman who didn't have any particular skills in this area. He didn't need them. It was really like, another banana trial. So she's currently confined to a Tel Aviv apartment. She says that she has been made stronger by this process, that she's met people in her detention, fellow prisoners, and shared stories, and that she's been made stronger. And she says, "They sent me to jail for writing a poem, but poetry has become my key to freedom, and I will hang on to that key until the end." So I'd like to read a newly translated poem by Darin Tatur. It's called "How Old Am I Now?" and it's translated by Ahmed Zaran. Out of the darkness of my night, out of my prison, out of my anger erupting like a volcano, out of my hollow life, out of my tears, out of my day drenched in sadness, I have come to you my fate, with perplexed diamond tears to register you my birth date, to ask, how old am I now? I am younger than all of them, yet by my griefs I am older than the days. A chill has fostered me and taught me of people's cunning. Treachery both orphaned and undressed me, and my eyes were buried in agony. Since I came to the world, need has shaped my image. These toys of mine are remnants of a missile, and when I am hungry, my food is fasting. At last I've come to know that I have nothing but tears and heaps of peace. It's a very beautiful poem. It's not the poem she was imprisoned for, but it's a fantastic poem. So, now I'd like to introduce the first speaker. Hani Ghazi is from Adalah. He is a Palestinian American, and he's from Ramallah. His father is from a West Bank village that is surrounded by Israeli settlements, and his mother is from East Jerusalem. So,
Thank you,
please.
Lynn.
Can you just repeat your first name?
My name is Hani,
Hani, hi.
and I'm with Adalah, New York, not to be confused with Adalah, the legal services office in East Jerusalem that provides legal services to Palestinian permanent residents and citizens of Israel. And thank you, Lynn. Actually, Palestinian Circus School is my most favorite charity, and it's the one I donate to the most every year. And its co-founder, Shadiz Morad, was my drama teacher in high school. They are the ones that are in the opening scene of Five Broken Cameras, if you've ever watched it. That's the Palestinian Circus School that does these shows for kids in refugee camps all over Palestine. All right, so I'm here representing Adalah, New York, the New York campaign for the boycott of Israel. And here at the Left Forum and at JVP, I feel like there is no need to discuss many of the basics because you already know them. So I'm going to focus on the most recent updates and challenges facing BDS. As member of Knesset, Hani Zarbi always says, we, the Palestinians, are divided, but only by geography and by our identification documents. And we did not choose to be divided that way. We range from citizens of Israel living in Nazareth and Haifa and other places to Palestinian citizens living in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority or in the blockade of the Gaza Strip, to Palestinians who have never entered Palestine for many generations since 1948. But we identify and we are united in identifying as Palestinians, and we are united in our struggle. With that being said, this call for BDS has been endorsed by over 170 Palestinian parties, organizations, trade unions, and movements that represent all of us in the Palestinian civil society, and they all agree on demanding that Israel recognize that Palestinian people's right to self-determination and is met according to and in compliance with international law by 1, ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. 2, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. And 3rd, but most important, not just accepting but also respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in the UN Resolution 194. BDS does not endorse a one-state or a two-state solution. It does, however, acknowledge that the status quo of Israel and Palestine is not 2 states. Palestine and Israel are one apartheid state. If you think that Israel and Palestine are 2 states and not one state where there's one government and one population dominant over the other, no wonder you don't understand BDS. So, in summary, BDS is a call by the Palestinian civil society upon all people of moral conscience around the world to impose economic, cultural, and academic boycotts and to implement divestment initiatives against Israel similar to those applied to South Africa in the apartheid era, because according to the international law definition of the crime of apartheid and according to the Rome Statute for the suppression of the crime of apartheid that was adopted by the United Nations, Israel is guilty of apartheid. Obviously I'm here with members of JVP, and I don't need to be the one explaining why it's not. But also, Israel does not target Israeli-owned businesses for being Israeli-owned. So it's also false and inaccurate to call it an anti-Israel movement. I'm obviously with a panelist who is Israeli. So if you see a newspaper or a news article that starts with anti-Israel activists or anti-Israel organizations are, just be aware that this is going to be a biased article. However, BDS targets, and I mean, yes, there are some Israeli companies that are targeted by the consumer boycott, like fresh fruits and vegetables, such as Jaffa citrus fruits and Israeli Medjool dates, Ahava Cosmetics, SodaStream, and so on. But many of the companies that are targeted by the economic boycott campaigns are not even Israeli. They are, however, companies that are complicit with because they profit from Israeli apartheid. Just like BDS movement does not discriminate against the activists who wish to join it, it also does not discriminate when it targets companies that are profiting from this apartheid based on the religion or the nationality of their owner. So, examples include Hewlett-Packard and Motorola for supplying Israel with surveillance systems around Israeli settlements, checkpoints, and military camps for supplying Israeli army with communications infrastructure and technology, and for the Israeli installed auto pass system, which is something that you might not be familiar with unless you are Palestinian, and unless you are a Palestinian ID or Palestinian Authority travel document holder. Is anybody else in this room a Palestinian who has that? Only one? And this is the first time, this system was the first time that we Palestinians have ever seen an identification document with a magnetic strip. We've never seen like until that time, which was like in the early 2000s. If we explore the Rome Statute on apartheid, it clearly states that it is apartheid when it is any measure that is designed to divide the population along racial lines by the creation of separate reserves and ghettos for members of a racial group. And that is why the BDS movement was launched in 2005, 1 year after the International Criminal Court declared that the separation barrier is illegal. There are boycott and divestment campaigns against Veolia, Caterpillar, and Volvo because they profit from Israel's illegal confiscation of Palestinian land. The term apartheid includes policies and practices of racial segregation and discrimination, as was practiced in South Africa, and applies to any act committed for the same purpose of establishing and maintaining one racial group's domination over another. The statute also identifies apartheid by one group's expropriation of landed property belonging to another racial group. This is why Israeli settlements and Israeli settlement expansion is considered apartheid, and it is target of boycott. BDS calls boycotting G4S as well because it equips Israeli prisons and detention centers where there are 6,800 Palestinian political prisoners held and tortured. So is Israel's mass incarceration enterprise, especially administrative detention and checkpoints, a practice of apartheid? Yes, because apartheid is also defined as any legislative measure where members of one racial group deprive members of another racial group of their freedom, dignity, subjecting them to torture, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment, and arbitrary arrests and punishment. And is G4S complicit with it? Yes, because G4S is profiting from it. Also in the Rome Statute and the United Nations definition, apartheid is any measure calculated to prevent a racial group from basic human rights and freedoms, such as the right to leave and return to your country. And the right, with that being said, Israel's land, sea, and air blockade of the Gaza Strip is clearly and undeniably a violation of international law and is clearly a practice of apartheid. The BDS movement does not only calls for economic boycott and divestment from businesses that profit from apartheid, but BDS movement also calls for cultural boycott against performers, artists, and events that whitewash this apartheid, and for the academic boycott against any academic institutions that provide the technological infrastructure for this apartheid. These daily and routine apartheid practices are not newsworthy to the biased mainstream Western mainstream media, and this is why an educational event series that started in that same year in 2005 called the Israeli Apartheid Week, it is aimed to raise public awareness about the routine and daily abuses of human rights that fit under the United Nations definition of the crime of apartheid. And it is aimed to grow and build support for the BDS movement. I started coordinating the Israeli Apartheid Week event series here in New York about 3 years ago, and I worked closely with organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine and other human rights organizations. And over the years, we've featured many events that feature, apartheid, whether it's like apartheid in policies in natural resources or apartheid policies in preventing mixed marriages, and so on. But we, over the years of me coordinating, we have not repeated any of these topics in a following year. So now that we understand that BDS movement highlights apartheid practices, this is what is freaking Israel out. It's the word apartheid. BDS movement, since its inception, has remained unchanged on its mission statement and on its strategies of resistance, as the title of this event. But challenging BDS is what evolved and what changed and has been increased and has been modified. So ask yourselves why. Why now? First, BDS went from being brushed off as ineffective or unrealistic when it first started, but then it became a target of being competed with by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. While BDS was growing organically around the world for free, with help of educational events and workshops like this one or Israeli Apartheid Week events, combating it by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has cost millions and millions of dollars. But all these efforts have either completely failed or completely backfired, or many of them, I should say. There are numerous examples of that, such as Brand Israel, Stand With Us, making Scarlett Johansson the face of SodaStream, and the swag bag that was given to the Oscar nominees this year. But now that BDS has moved to become not a target of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which places it at the same level of security threat to Israel as Iran. So what does that mean? If you're unsure of the success of the BDS movement, ask yourself the question, why now? Why is it happening now? And the answer is its successes, its mission statement, its message for equality and justice and human rights, and it's also its fact-checked and evidence-supported education and lobbying, and the United Nations reports said that BDS was a key factor behind the drop of foreign direct investment in Israel in recent years. The World Bank cited Israel as a key factor behind the 24% drop of Palestinian imports from Israel. And Israeli governments even issued reports about BDS to cost Israel billions of dollars. Some successes. French corporate giant Veolia sold off all its businesses in Israel, and this was a direct result of the 7-year campaign against it because of its role in infrastructure projects for illegal Israeli settlements, and that cost Veolia more than $20 billion in lost contracts. It's not just Veolia. Telecommunications giant Orange responded to BDS pressure in France, Egypt, and elsewhere by saying it will pull out of Israel by 2017. Even G4S started talking about ending its contracts with Israeli prison service. As for cultural boycott, which is less financially detrimental to Israeli apartheid, but definitely more noticeable and just as threatening to Israeli apartheid, because it is following the same path of isolating Israel in the same way apartheid South Africa was back in the 80s. Major artists and cultural organizations are responding to the call of BDS. Artists have canceled their concerts, and 2 major music festivals, summer music festivals, have been canceled in summer of 2013 and summer of 2014. And to shed some light on the local initiatives of cultural boycott, Adalah, New York launched a video of prominent artists pledging to boycott Israel and not perform in Israel. And we launched it in an event that was in Brooklyn in November of last year. We called it Palestine Calling, the launch party to amplify the cultural boycott of Israel. So now, let's discuss the most recent updates and challenges against BDS. So as I mentioned, it's being challenged more now by the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which means that Israel is using its diplomatic relations to crush BDS. First approach, which is also not working, is the false and baseless accusations. In Hillary Clinton's open letter to Haim Saban, the media giant and one of her multi-billionaire donors, and just like in her speech at AIPAC 2 months ago, she of course accused BDS of being anti-Semitic, no surprise there, but she also accused it of using hate speech. Many politicians are also following the same pattern of accusing BDS of using hate speech because they have to do whatever it takes to, grow the most money from their donors, and also to, because they are pressured and because they are, doing what's best for their electoral campaign. But none of these accusers have been able to show any evidence of using this hate speech. Me as a representative of Adalah, New York, I can tell anybody that is accusing BDS activists of using hate speech to go to our website, to go to our Facebook page, to come to our protests, take pictures of our signs, or even record our chants. And if there is any use of hate speech, where is it? Nobody has been able to provide any evidence of that. So, opposing BDS has evolved to silencing BDS activists by force. BDS activists, especially students for justice in Palestine, who are motivated, persistent, and perseverant, unpaid volunteers, unlike social media officers hired by Brand Israel or, Stand With Us. And that is happening on college campuses, especially CUNY, like this very campus. Just 2 days ago, there was 2 students that were to appear on Friday for a public hearing because they violated certain rules of code of conduct, and their legal counsel assured that this hearing will be public. But the morning of, they closed it. Security did not allow any faculty members or any students to enter this hearing, and they gave no reasons. And these students were not found guilty of violating any codes of conduct. But still, SJP is widely accused on CUNY campuses of thuggish intimidation. Well, if this is not thuggish intimidation, then what is? Now let's talk about silencing BDS on a governmental level. In an article in The Independent, the UK government announced that it will be illegal for city councils, public bodies, and even some university student unions to refuse to buy goods and services from companies involved in the arms trade, fossil fuels, tobacco products, or Israeli settlements that occupied West Bank. And anybody that violates that will face severe penalties. Here in the United States, there are efforts to criminalize BDS. And this is where our work is most vital and key. Here in the state of New York, there are 2 bills pending in front of the legislature. Assembly Bill A-9036, which would impose a boycott ban on any U.S. ally as defined by the bill, and to create a blacklist of individuals, institutions, and organizations advocating boycott and make it illegal for the state to do business with them. The New York Senate bill, Senate Bill S-6086 is a bill that relates to purchasing restrictions on persons boycotting Israel and the investment of certain public funds in companies boycotting Israel. Basically, it is a legislation to amend the state finance law such that it would outlaw the right to boycott and to create a blacklist of BDS supporters and to deny government contracts or funding to any individual, institution, or company supporting BDS. This bill has passed the Assembly. But the latest on this bill is that its proponents are meeting and discussing how to address the unconstitutionality of this legislation. And that means that we have succeeded in making it clear that this anti-boycott legislation is a violation of free speech rights. And this bill has not been signed into law by the governor and has not been moved to the floor for a vote yet. But when it is, now that they know that we mobilize very quickly, this will be moved as quickly as possible, and at that time, we have to work together and be prepared to work immediately. Now, most alarmingly, a Palestinian co-founder of BDS movement, Omar Barghouti, he holds a permanent resident status in Israel, and in order to travel, the Israeli Ministry of Internal Affairs has to approve his travel documents. Because he's not a citizen, he holds a travel document, and they refuse to renew it, and therefore he is unable to leave and re-enter Palestine. And I would like to end with this quote of Omar Barghouti, and this is what I usually use when I present BDS to organizations or student groups that are voting on whether or not to endorse BDS. Neutrality never helps the oppressed, but it fully supports the oppressor. This is what Omar Barghouti said last time he was here in New York, and he presented with Rebecca from JVP last time he was here in New York. As of now, his travel documents are not renewed, and his residency status is being revised. So this is an alarming level of silencing free speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was It's very, very clear and informed presentation of BDS. And Jewish Voice for Peace endorses BDS, and I don't want to spend a lot of time going into this absurdity right here of anti-Zionism being anti-Semitism. We, Jewish Voice for Peace, we're a Jewish organization. We have a rabbinical council. We are very proud of our Jewish tradition, and we endorse BDS. And many of us, we don't take a position on Zionism. Jewish Voice for Peace doesn't, but many of us are not Zionists. So it's absurd, and I could spend the whole time talking about this, but I think it's more important to go on to the next speaker. Ellen Isaacs is a fellow member of Jewish Voice of Peace. She's a recently retired physician. She's made 7 visits to Israel, Palestine, 3 medical service and fact-finding missions, and subsequently co-led trips of human rights and political activists. And she's also been a communist member of the Progressive Labour Party since the 60s. Isaac.
Thank you. So, as Lynne said, although I am very proud to be an activist with Jewish Voice for Peace, the comments which I'm actually going to make today, mostly about the one state idea, are more shaped by the fact that I'm a communist and member of Progressive Labor Party. So as Lynne said, I've been there about 7 times. I first went as a doctor, and although we provided some service in the West Bank, the group I was with felt that what we could accomplish medically was quite limited, and our real function was to learn about the situation so we could come back and talk about it, which our prestigious doctors gave us a little more leeway to do. Since then, I've been back several times leading groups of young people and teachers, more from a human rights perspective, not medically. And in August of 2014, a colleague and I were visiting the West Bank and returning to see Dr. Mazen Kumsia, who'd been very friendly to us in the past. He's a biology professor at the University of Bethlehem and a very well-known activist and author. And he invited us to attend a conference in Ramallah on the one democratic state in Greater Palestine. Now, personally, I hadn't really been aware of this movement before, and I was very glad to hear about it because all the Palestinians I had met on my previous trips had been very supportive of the two-state solution. None of them that I had met thought much of Fatah, the leadership in the West Bank, or of Hamas, the leadership in Gaza, but nonetheless they had the point of view that you had to establish an independent state and then you would worry about the leadership and the structure of that state later. So I had many long discussions disagreeing with that point of view with my Palestinian friends. And so I was very glad to hear about the one-state movement, which has been holding conferences actually since 2007, although the idea had been around for quite a while before that. And this movement was endorsed by many prominent Palestinians, including Omar Barghouti and some Israelis. So this conference that I attended in Ramallah the first time, there were 2 speakers. One was Dr. Kumsia, and the other was Ilan Pappé, who you've probably heard of. He's an Israeli historian, and he's been forced to teach outside of Israel since he gained access to the papers of Ben-Gurion and exposed the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in his famous book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, which, as I'm sure you know, involved killing or displacing 750,000 Palestinians and destroying over 500 villages. So Pape's talk made a very convincing case that Israel never intended to allow a Palestinian state, but had been paying lip service to the two-state solution for many years in order to quell opposition in Palestine and internationally to the occupation, while they continued to seize and displace Palestinians and lay siege to Gaza. So the Israeli intention, he said, and with which I and many other people agree, was that the Israeli intention was always just to seize as much land as possible of Greater Palestine while disposing of as many Palestinians as possible. Dr. Kumsia added that what he felt was needed was a mass movement that united Palestinians and anti-occupation Israelis if there was going to be any hope of establishing a secular multi-ethnic state. And he suggested such joint tactics as mass demonstrations at the wall. But I think that up until now, this movement has largely been an intellectual exercise that hasn't really directly engaged in struggle, which has been, I think, its main weakness. Today, we are seeing a certain amount of rebellion by young people who are very frustrated with the endless occupation, certain that no end is in sight, and frustrated with their leadership. But it doesn't appear to represent an organized movement. And certainly on my last visit there, I asked many Palestinians I met, and I've questioned every Palestinian speaker I've heard since then in the last 8 months or so, is there any real mass organized opposition going on in Palestine? And basically people say no. The main movement, as we just heard about, has been BDS, which has been very successful in organizing international consciousness and opposition, but it's mainly an external strategy. The other thing I think that's been missing from the one-state formulation is that there's no real discussion of what kind of state, other than sort of the very vague democratic, quote unquote, which is being envisioned. So the point that came home to me is that we live here in a single state that's said to be democratic. It's also one of the richest in the world, not under occupation, not under attack, no walls, no internal strife, very much. And yet, obviously, we still have huge differences here in the well-being, in the health, the wealth, employment, between blacks and whites and other minority groups. And I think it's interesting if you examine and compare some of the differences between black and white in US and between Arab and Jew in Palestine, you come up with some interesting parallels. Like in the occupied territories, 40% of all males have been or are in prison. In the United States, 1/3 of all black men have also spent time in prison. In the occupied territories, there is a completely separate military justice system for Palestinians than the Israeli justice system that applies to Jews. Now, in the US, we supposedly have one court system, but I think, as we all know, Black and Latino men are much more likely to be arrested than whites for similar offenses and receive much harsher penalties. In Israel and Palestine, there is a 10-year difference in life expectancy between Jews and Palestinians. In New York City, there is a 5-year difference in life expectancy between blacks and whites. Nationally, in the last year, they say that this difference has slightly decreased, but that's because the death rate for whites has gone up due to suicides and drug overdoses, so it's kind of like a race to the bottom. If you look at the differences in infant mortality, it's 5 times greater for Palestinians than it is for Jews. But in New York City, the difference is 3 times greater for blacks than white New Yorkers. So although the disparities are a little greater between Arab and Jew in Palestine, they are still very marked in the United States and of a similar degree of magnitude, despite us having a single so-called democratic state where we actually have many laws against discrimination. The point I think is important is that Israel and occupied Palestine, similar to the United States, are also both capitalist states. Now, in Palestine, you could say, truthfully, that all classes are suffering from the occupation, but that doesn't change the fact that there are classes. This was first very evident to me, who hadn't thought about it much, when I first saw Ramallah in 2005, where you have a city where there are many beautiful restaurants and luxury homes. Not that everybody's living that way, but in the middle of a country full of impoverished villages and refugee camps. And recently, Ali Abu Nima has written a book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine, in which he discusses this question of the economics of Palestine, which isn't discussed very widely. And he makes the point that a very small elite dominates the Palestinian economy and also has very close ties to Israel. 78% of the Palestine Stock Exchange is controlled by the Palestine Development and Investment Company, PATICO, which is owned by a very few rich families. And Palestine is second to the worst in the world for the ratio of management to unskilled labor incomes. Of course, Israel is also a very inegalitarian society controlled by a very small ruling elite. There are 18 ruling families that have incomes equal to 77% of the national budget and take in 32% of the profits from the 500 largest companies. You have 3 large banks presiding over 80% of the market and taking 70% of the profits. The income gaps between the 90th and 50th percentiles and between the 50th and 10th are the highest in the world. And these differentials in Israel are also very highly race-based, with immigrant workers from Africa and South Asia are the worst paid, as are Palestinians, and dark-skinned Israelis of Asian or African heritage are also very low on the wage scale. So there is something called the General Inequality Index, or GINI, which you can find very easily on the internet, which is a measure of inequality within a society, of which there are many graphs. And depending on what year you look, the United States and Israel are always right next to each other. Sometimes they're in 3rd and 4th place, or sometimes in 4th and 5th place in the whole world. And you basically on these graphs never see Palestine, but people have calculated the economic inequality in Palestine in the same way, and it comes out to actually be equal to that of Israel. So you have the US, Israel, and Palestine right next to each other near the top of this inequality index. So that's why I think that even though we should be talking about a single, non-racist, secular state in all of Greater Palestine, I think that such a state would need to have a new economic structure if you really want to talk about being able to provide good health, education, jobs, housing, and anti-racism in that society. The elites of Palestine and Israel would be very happy to get together and continue to exploit Israelis and other exploit Palestinians, and other minority populations. And in fact, there are some businessmen in Israel that promote that idea. And, currently the leadership, the Palestinian Authority, the leadership in the West Bank, spends over 1/4 of its budget on security, more than on health and education combined. And most of this security is designed to repress dissent against Israel. They're such a reliable partner for Israel that before the invasions of Gaza, the Israeli government warned the Palestinian Authority in advance so that they would be able to repress dissent against the invasions. And they did such an effective job that Israel was able to remove its soldiers from the West Bank and concentrate them all on the invasions of Gaza. So I think that the rich capitalists of Israel and Palestine would be very glad to cooperate even more closely in a single state, unless we make the nature of that state a very specific demand. So I think, I don't want to sound pie in the sky. I think clearly the creation of a single egalitarian state is not attainable now or anytime soon, but I think having such a goal in mind is important because it provides a framework for how you would choose to organize in the present. Like in the United States, we strive very hard for multiracial unity, which we need if we're going to be able to win significant reforms or build a long-range movement. And I think that this is the outlook that Arab and Jewish workers need to have also in Israel and Palestine. It's not that widely known that there was a lot of Israeli and Palestinian worker unity in the 1920s through the early 1940s. And the elites of both sides worked very hard to develop nationalism to divide that unified trade union movement. It's also hard to envision successful movements of struggle, which I think we're going to hear more about, in a society with so much repression. But I think it's important to aim for tactics which unite Israelis and who are anti-occupation as much as possible. We certainly can rely on the fact that all Palestinians are angry. Many Israelis are angry about conditions in their society too, because there's a tremendous amount of unemployment, low wages, scarce housing, and the mass demonstrations in 2011 are said to have been supported by about 85% of the population. Unfortunately, there was no mention during that movement of the occupation or where the money in Israel goes. But there certainly is a small minority of Israelis that understand that Israelis' militarism is the cause of many of these economic problems and who do not want to be part of this fascist enterprise. And so I think, as Dr. Kumsia and others have said, we need to think about mass struggles that could unite sympathetic Israelis and Arabs and focus on things like checkpoints, things like the wall, where both societies meet. And okay, I think I'll leave all that part out. So I think the other lesson is that we have to rely on struggles that are led by the rank and file, that you can't rely on politicians, that you can't rely on the elite, and you can't rely on NGOs to lead these struggles for you. And that some of the friends that I have in Israel are trying to work in organizations that already do involve Israelis and Palestinians together, such as the Union of Daycare Workers, who come from both nationalities. So I think that in Israel, Palestine, as well as in the United States, as well as in every other country in the world, in the long run, we need to be thinking about building a society where production is for need and not profit, and where racism and sexism are illegal, And really what such a society is called is communism. And I think people are very afraid of that word, not only because we're brought up to hate it, but also because we look at revolutions that have taken place in the Soviet Union and in China, and we see that they've turned into their opposites. And so it's easy to become very cynical. But my point of view, our point of view, is that it wasn't a matter of human nature. It was a matter of mistakes that were made, which often happens when people are trying to do things for the first couple of times. I would say that those mistakes had to do with thinking of communism not as what they were fighting for in the immediate future, but as really as something that they envisioned happening many decades hence. And that meanwhile, they allowed many of the inequalities of the old society to persevere, such as wage differentials, divisions of labor, and that so maybe we will learn that next time we will try to do things differently. But to my mind, we are living in a world where climate disaster or world war, possibly nuclear war, is easily 20, 30, 100 years in the near future. And we have to begin to think about making very fundamental revolutionary change, or we all face being obliterated. So, and I think we can do that.
That basically this is a Jewish Voice for Peace workshop, but all our views are our own. We're not representing Jewish Voice for Peace's views, although I've talked a bit about them, and certainly Jewish Voice for Peace does not go endorse communism or doesn't go into any of that stuff at all. And I'm not even talking about my own views on that, but we don't go there. We're just dealing with certain aspects of this whole situation. So our last speaker is Elik Elhanan. Dr. Elhanan, military refuser, served as a soldier in an IDF combat unit from 1995 to 98. In 1997, his sister Smadar was killed by a Palestinian suicide bombing in Jerusalem. Elik was one of the founding members of Combatants for Peace. He served as the group's Israeli coordinator. He was among the Israeli activists on board the boat to Gaza, the BDS-ISRAEL. Elik Elhanan.
Thank you. Well, I'll try to be brief and not too discouraging, but I want to offer some reflections, some recent thoughts I had on this question of activism and our struggle back home, and maybe some critique of that struggle as well as I see it today. I mean, so you'll excuse me if what I have to say is not very well formed and not very articulate, but it is kind of a work in process, and it's very much based on my experiences as an activist, anti-occupation and peace activist in Israel, Palestine. Now, I've been involved in this type of activism, well, just shy of 20 years. I started with my family in around 1998, and we're still at it today. I was involved with a variety of groups, namely the first one was the Israeli-Palestinian Bereaved Family Circle, which is a group that brings Israelis and Palestinians, bereaved families from both sides. Later on, I joined an initiative of Israeli soldiers who refused to participate in combat in the West Bank, Courage to Refuse, Later on, I was among the founding members of Combatants for Peace, a group that brought together Israeli and Palestinian combatants in an effort to support and promote nonviolent resistance to the occupation. I was also participant in many of the activities of Anarchists Against the Walls in Israel, Ta'ayush, Breaking the Silence, other organizations. I spent a lot of time in the villages of Bilin or Nebi Saleh, Ma'asara, and other villages where the popular nonviolent struggle against the apartheid wall takes place. And I mean, not lastly, but kind of the most bombastic title on this list, I did participate in the attempt to break the siege on Gaza on board the SV Estelle in 2012. And I must say that the experience of, again, nearly 20 years in this game has been one of astounding failure. In a certain sense, we never succeeded in any of our missions. The violence is not reduced, the occupation is not over, Gaza is not free, the wall is still standing, bereaved families are always more. And in a certain sense, there is this very strong feeling that, well, all our efforts have been for nothing. Not necessarily for nothing, but actually for the worst, because the situation in Israel is so much worse now than when we started. And the descent of Israel into full-fledged and open and sincere fascism is a process that I really do believe that the radical left had a significant part in. And this sensation of failure in front of the task at hand is, I mean, it's a hard one, personally, but it's also politically a very discouraging sensation that leads to, I think, well, quite a number of political, theoretical, and practical problems in politics, which I view, and that I say from my own personal experience, one of the things that it brings about is this kind of inconsistency of struggle. I mean, we had a certain idea with the courage to refuse. We found it lacking. We created a new group, Combatants for Peace. With time, we find that lacking as well. We ended up, some of us at least, in more radical circles, and then so forth and so forth, constantly looking for this, the answer, the one thing to do that will end the occupation, that will resolve this situation, this unbearable reality of apartheid and expropriation on the ground has to stop, and we constantly look for this one answer. Recently, I mean, the one state is this kind of magical solution that sponsors a lot of learned debates in a bunch of conferences, but again, has very, very little impact on the ground. And in a certain sense, this is a situation that I personally was not comfortable with, and led me to a certain and to a number of reflections on the question. And in a certain sense, when I think of this experience of being an activist in Israel, so there is something very bipolar and confusing about this experience. Because, as I told you, on the one hand, there is this constant sensation of failure. Everything we do is, well, it doesn't change the situation for the better, and it usually changes the situation for the worse. On the other hand, if I'm honest with myself, the experience of the past 18 years has been one of inspiration, and has been one of empowerment, and has been one of really development and learning and growing in a whole number of ways. Each time we set out with a new project, it seemed preposterous, it seemed improbable, and to a certain except with our kind of high goal of ending the occupation, we never really failed. When this preposterous idea of bringing together Israeli and Palestinian combatants came about, we kind of thought of it as a one-time thing, a one shot. If it'll work, great, we'll get media attention. If it won't, and it probably won't, okay, we'll disappear like so many other initiatives like that. And the fact is that, I mean, we didn't receive any media attention, but we didn't fail either. We didn't disappear. Combatants for Peace is still around, 10 years, I mean, it's just now been recently 10 years since we established the organization, and it brings together hundreds of members. In the same sense, you know, the kind of the struggle against the wall did not bring the wall down anywhere, and in that sense is experienced as a profound failure, but on the other hand, it is not. Because what happened there was a tiny little village in the West Bank stood up and stands up to the Israeli army every weekend for 11 years now, and there is something powerful and inspiring about that, which in a sense led me to think that we kind of, and when I say we, I speak very specifically of the activist circles in Israel. I don't have much to say about the Palestinian organizations. The last thing they need is another Israeli speaking for them. But talking about the experience on the ground in Israel and our cooperations with Palestinian comrades in the West Bank, and even in Gaza, in a certain sense, what I feel is that both we are wrong in the way we define our goals, and both in the way that we calibrate our expectations. And this is something that both breeds the sense of failure and kind of shuts many political avenues that could have been available for us are not considered and are not taken because of these problems. And this problem is namely this type of, well, I'll say the two problems. The first one is this kind of fixation with efficacy and with the need of the struggle to be efficient, relevant, have an impact, have an influence, without anyone stopping to think, what does it mean to have an impact? What does it mean to have an influence? What does it mean to create change? And this type of back and forth argument creates a lot of, I think, fissures inside what could have been a united front. For example, I mean, the anarchists fail because they're a tiny little group. They're so much busy with being self-righteous and alienating everybody else who doesn't want to look like them that, I mean, they will never succeed in doing anything. On the other hand, Breaking the Silence or Combatants for Peace are compromising and moderate. They hang on to their like white masculine identity, and therefore this is why they fail. And you can go on group by group and find all those kind of ideological and political sins and errors of faith that they commit, and this is why they fail. This is why they're not efficient. This is why they can't intervene. And I think that this way of thinking is extremely problematic, and it is compounded by a second problem. And this is a certain, and this is aversion that we have on the left of hope and of optimism and of anything that feels kind of positive and inspiring other than the end goal. And in that respect, if something appears to be like a positive development, if something appears to be like an opening for something else, well, it's very important to shoot it down because it doesn't stand up to the rules of the dogma. Either it's too alienating, either it's not alienating enough, it's too pragmatic, it's not pragmatic enough. But all of these ideas are wrong. And in that respect, I think we miss out on a very, very important both reality that exists in Israel-Palestine and possibilities for the future, for the struggle in Israel-Palestine. And I mean, thinking about it, the title I gave to this talk, which I see does not appear anywhere, but I was thinking of those, I'm sorry for, I mean, if it's too heavy-handedly communist here today, but of these ideas of these very important terms of the important communist Antonio Gramsci, who was talking about class warfare in the term of a war of maneuver or a war of position. Now, a war of maneuver, very simply, is when, you take to the street, you take the centers of power, you take over the country. You move around, you maneuver, you occupy, and you win. And this is, a very easy, both it's easy to imagine, and it's easy to relate to. And I think that, especially in the context of Israel-Palestine, with the reality of now, it's 49 years of stagnation, this idea of just, one blow and we're done is very compelling. However, I think we have to admit that this possibility is not available for us. And this takes, I think, a lot of courage and certain degree of maturity on the part of the activist to recognize that at this point, in this reality now in Israel, we cannot win. We do not have this possibility. We were talking about mass demonstrations. We were thinking about, Yeshayahu Leibovich, a great philosopher in Israel, said when 500 combat officers will refuse to serve in the army, everything will change. People said, if Mizrahi activists will join, nothing changes. And we kind of need to understand that we don't have the capacity to change right now, which is a rather humbling understanding. And which is very different. Hani here talk about the BDS and their remarkable successes around the world, who's definitely making headway, about the diplomatic initiative of the PA, whether we think, whatever a criticism of it might be, they are also making headway. And the reality on the ground is so remarkably different. Now, and I think this causes this kind of reality of frustration. However, we totally ignore the other side of this way of thought, which is the war of position. Which means that this is, in Gramsci's work, it's sort of a preliminary step, one step before, in the reality where we cannot challenge power directly, we cannot challenge the hegemony directly. Our task as activists is to fortify our positions, to create a community, a counter-hegemony that will be able to challenge the central power, and mainly the central hegemony, the central ideas and ideology that guide and maintain the Israeli, the Israeli state and the Israeli occupation. And I do think that this is something that we are very often overlooking, and this is something that we are very often very hasty to disregard, but that in that respect, if we look at what goes on the ground in Israel, Palestine, from that perspective, then indeed there are very, very interesting and important things that are going on. And this is, I will conclude with several remarks on that, and this is in a sense, the personal part of my, of all this reflection. I should make it clear I don't represent any organization here. I'm definitely not part of CCNY in any political way. I don't represent them or any way affiliated to that place. I don't represent the Family Forum or Combatants for Peace or any other group. I am, and I'll tell you why. Because I still have a certain, a great degree of difference from these organizations. The Family Forum, which I think is a remarkable organization, but politically is very moderate. For example, they do not support BDS, they do not support refusing to serve in the army, and they, of course, they support the two states. Combatants for Peace, more radical and precise in what they're saying, but still, they oppose BDS, and they support the two-state solution. Other organizations who are found further to the radical left have a tendency of disregarding the question of conscientious objection, viewing it as some kind of a privileged position that has no place in the political discussion. So in a sense, I have this very weird position where I am a member, a participant, and very closely attached to a number of organizations that I strongly disagree with. And as things progressed, for me, I was among the founding members of Combatant for Peace. I was the Israeli director in 1906, 1907. But progressively, I moved away from the works of this organization, looking for something that would be slightly, again, more effective, would have more impact. However, very recently, I came back and participated in several of the activities of the Family Forum and Combatants for Peace. Namely, two things that these groups, or three things that these groups are doing. One is the peace marches against the wall in the area of Bethlehem that takes place every month, organized by Combatants for Peace. The second thing is those speaking circles that the Family Forum organizes in the center of Tel Aviv, where simply they bring members, activists, Palestinians, if they can, but members of the organization, simply, in the middle of nowhere, just address people in the street to talk about these questions. And the third is the Israeli-Palestinian Alternative Memorial Day. Now, all these three activities came under very, very, very severe criticism from both sides, either from the Israeli mainstream or from the, let's say, more radical left. But I see in those things something that is remarkably promising and is very important exactly for our goals. And because all these three initiatives are founded on two very important principles. One is community. It is very simply a regular event, a regular place where like-minded people come together. And with the insanity that goes on in Israel right now, it's good to meet like-minded people. You can talk, you can exchange views, you can argue even, because some support BDS and others don't. There's one-state people and others aren't, etc. But it becomes a very, very fertile ground for the exchange of ideas and, in that sense, also for the development of partnerships and strategies of resistance. But more important than that, all these things challenge key ideas of the Israeli political and cultural hegemony, which is founded on one idea, and that is there cannot be any cooperation with Palestinians. If you want a central idea of Israeli political hegemony, from the lunatic right until the so-called Zionist left, it's that. Palestinians do not have a part, do not have a voice in the political organization of Israel. And this is the main thing that these kind of initiatives challenge. First of all, because they are joint organizations where everything is done together, everything is organized and planned together. I mean, it's been 10 years for Combatants for Peace. Everything is very badly organized and very poorly planned, but it is planned together. And in a certain sense, this is my understanding, the mission of Combatants for Peace was not and should never have been to end the occupation, but rather to develop an Israeli-Palestinian political language, a possibility of working and struggling together to change the situation. And this is something that comes to place in both these initiatives. Now, the other aspect of it is that both the memorial, Alternative Memorial Day ceremony and those speaking circles that the Bereaved Parent Circle organize, they do something else that is extremely important, and they question the supremacy of Jewish suffering in general and very specifically on this ground. Now, this is a question that is acute in Israeli politics. I mean, very recently, a very prominent radio person, by no means a leftist, nearly lost his job for suggesting that Palestinian mothers might actually have feelings when their children die, to the point that the police commissioner in Israel had to go publicly and say that, no, they don't. And then, in a sense, bringing Palestinian bereaved parents to speak in the center of Tel Aviv, bringing bereaved Israeli parents to address kind of these non-conventional opinions in the center of Tel Aviv, has a very huge impact. Now, and just one last word, this was the ceremony, the Alternative Memorial Day ceremony comes into place. I mean, Memorial Day is a tremendously important day in Israel. It's kind of the one day, I mean, maybe not second, before Yom Kippur. It's the one day nobody questions its sanctity, except that we kind of do. We, first of all, I mean, I take a little bit of pride in that because I kind of green-lighted the first one that happened, and my kid brother was the speaker in this very recent one that happened. It's been 10 years that this kind of preposterous idea has been taking place, and we started with maybe a few hundred people arrived, which was already a few hundred people more than we thought would arrive. And every year, progressively since then, we need to search for a new venue, a bigger venue. It went from 300 to 400 to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, there were nearly 5,000 present in this ceremony, which in a sense shows, just demonstrates that, I mean, this, while our experience is of absolute failure in addressing and in interpolating the Israeli public, in a certain sense, this failure is on us. because there is a public there that is willing to come when we present something that is worth coming to. And of course, I mean, it's very confused. It's absolutely not ideologically sound, and it doesn't have very strong bases in theory or anything like that. But in reality, we managed to bring 5,000 people every year to a ceremony in which, instead of talking about the exclusive Israeli pain, we speak of the Palestinians who died because of our actions. When we speak of the pain on the other side, when we urge people, when they are in their most kind of intimate, self-absorbed place, no, think of the others. And people respond to that call. And in that sense, I think this is my sensation that as activists in Israel, when we're speaking of strategies of resistance, the first tactical but also strategic understanding is that we need to listen to what people tell us. If we have failed in bringing the masses to our cause, if it's the one state or the end of the occupation or the economic structure in Israel, it's to a very large extent because we were not able to formulate a correct message. It's because I believe we were so hell-bent on destroying any fake hope that was out there, because we were so concerned with what is the right organization, without realizing that in the situation now, well, practically any organization, as long as they oppose the occupation, they oppose the apartheid, they are willing to condemn Israeli military action and the annexation of land. Any organization that is in that part of the political playing field is a valid partner. And in a sense, our objective now is to create a platform, or should be, our objective should be, to create a platform that will be inclusive enough to contain all these different voices, while being explicit and undeterred in our fight against the occupation. And in that respect, I think we have a lot of work ahead of us developing this type of language. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let's open this up to questions and discussion.
It's the same day.
It's the same. And in a sense, this is also why, in a certain sense, I mean, there's a lot of criticism about this day, and I share quite a bit of it, but there is something that is quite remarkable on that, because, I mean, if anything, this is a very important day, and now we're talking about the bereaved parents or the bereaved families, many of which died during their military service. There are other memorials, there are official memorials, there are family memorials, there are, like, you know, neighborhood or village memorial. I mean, people have to choose where to go. It's not that it's something additional, they need to choose to come to ours and kind of let go of the mainstream narrative, which, if you want, is still maybe the only inclusive place in Israeli society today. And the very interesting thing is that they do come. And for the same token, I mean, the courage of the Palestinians who are willing to come and talk on that day, such a charged and complicated date. I mean, many of them are also members in the bereaved parent circles that, you know, there's no need to be squeamish about it. Their children were killed by the children commemorated on the Memorial Day in Israel. And I think that this kind of display of courage and humanity and integrity on the Palestinian side is a very, very important component in what convinces many Israelis, to give up on their place inside this kind of Israeli inclusiveness and go listen to these things. Now, on occasion, we also, we held it simultaneously both in Tel Aviv and in the West Bank. We live streamed it in Nablus and in other places where also many more Palestinians could attend and participate via Skype, etc.
The biggest thing to take out of my presentation and the biggest lesson to learn is there's a big difference between shaming Israel and shaming Israelis and shaming Israeli apartheid. There are vital partners in Israel with us that are like Boycott from Within and Who Profits and other researchers and other activists who are Israeli. So there is a big difference between shaming Israelis and Israel and being anti-Israel, which is what I was talking about when I said that mainstream media does, and Israeli apartheid. Well, I mean, okay, so the mainstream collective voice of Israelis recently, it has been evident that racism is the mainstream. It is not coincidental. It is actually the pillar of the results of the most recent elections that elected the most racist and most right-wing extremist government in Israel. And that is because they are, profiting and benefiting from the status quo. And this is what we're gonna, this is what the BDS aims to change.
Elected democratic leadership that is rightfully elected, whether they're Palestinians or Jews, or as long as they're citizens of this country. Now, that said, I do think that our experience shows that, it's a very charged question, but it is possible. For example, in the recent, since the last elections, the most interesting and let's say the most inclusively progressive force in Israeli politics is the Palestinian Joint List. And looking at the leader of the list, Ayman Odeh, I would think that more and more and more Israelis will be willing, it's still kind of a slogan, of the so-called Zionist left, get rid of the occupied territories or you'll have Ahmed Tibi as your prime minister. However, looking at Israeli politics now, all the Bennett and Lieberman and all those pyromaniacs and lunatics that are there, many more Israelis are saying, yeah, well, Tibi is not all that bad. And Ayman Odeh, he's a fantastic person. So you can see these things growing and developing, but this is precisely what I was talking about. There is a dialogue and a process to be had here. And in a certain sense, positing that as the entry requirement, well, for the very least, from a revolutionary perspective, I think it's extremely ineffective. One should allow people to grow inside the political process, rather than expect them to have all the consciousness needed at the door. Now, of course, I agree with you. This should be a goal when this question, we'll know that we reached somewhere when this question is no longer relevant. And whoever is the best leader and whoever is elected, that's the leadership, regardless of race or creed.
I want to make a comment about that also, because in Israel, Palestine, in here, in many parts of the world, we have racism and we have super exploitation of blacks or immigrants or Palestinians or whoever. But the way we have to divide people up in terms of our allies is by class, not by ethnicity or race. There are exploited people in Israel, there are exploited whites here, but we all have to understand how racism, whatever country it's in, drags everybody down, lowers the standards for everybody, and keeps people divided. That's the most important thing. If we want a movement for justice in this country, or any country, it's going to have to involve unity between blacks and whites, and it's what your ideas are that are going to determine and your struggle who's in leadership. We have a black president here. Is that a victory for anybody? It's a deception. You can say, in a sense, it was a step forward that white people could vote for a black person, but you essentially have a black president who is a leader of the ruling class that promotes racism. It hasn't done anything for anybody to have a black president. The question is what your ideas are, and what class interests you're uniting around. And I think so we need to build a multiracial movement in both societies. And there are certainly, you know, as I tried to stress, the leadership in Palestine is very bad for Palestinians and is much in league with the leadership in Israel. They're their servants, in essence. So I don't agree with that formulation of how you divide people up.
But I think we're going to have, this has been a wonderful learning experience for me also. Thank you. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Hani. Thank you, Elik. And thank you.